return shortly. I would like to introduce the next part of this session, which consists of a presentation titled "The Need for a New Norm, Internet Impact Assessments," which will be held by the Director of Policy Development and Research of the Internet Society, Carl Gunberg, and he will be joining us online. Carl, when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. First of all, a big thank you to the organizers for inviting me to join online and to be able to do this presentation online, which is really super. So the presentation that I have today is around this new norm that we're championing around internet impact assessments. And this goes back to work that we've been doing at the Internet Society for a couple of years now. Going back to 2020, where we built effectively a toolkit that is trying to describe how this can be done. So the idea behind today's presentation is to walk you through a little bit of the work that we've done over the past couple of years, and also to take you through a formal case study where we put this framework to work and illustrate what an impact assessment could look like. But to start with setting the scene a little bit, I'm sure many of you are perhaps familiar with the headlines that you see, or similar headlines, because there is a lot of headlines out there. And that was really the starting point for our work. We saw a lot of headlines coming up, and we saw a lot of issues that were related to the internet and that were coming in different forms. It could be concerns around internet consolidation, it could be misinformation, cybersecurity, privacy. Most recently this year, we've had the issue around sanctions and how that could impact the internet. So in the midst of all this, we see a need to address different challenges that comes with the internet. But at the same time, there is a concern that in addressing those challenges, it can also cause harm to the very thing that you're trying to protect. So our goal was to try to figure out how do we find that balance in making sure that we can address the things that needs to be addressed, while at the same time preserving what needs to be preserved. So this question that you see on the screen was quite literally the question that we had in front of us when we started the project back in 2020. How can we better support decision making, both in policy and in technology, make sure that things can be addressed, but at the same thing, preserve what needs to be preserved. And that sort of solution to that question, we found inspiration in another policy field, namely the environmental policy field. And what we learned from them was that over the past decades, one of the very successful tools in the environmental space has been the practice of conducting environmental impact assessment. So just when you're building a new highway, it's not only the socioeconomic considerations that are included, but also an environmental impact assessment that supports the decision making, that broadens the considerations of the impact of a given policy or a given measure. So we draw inspiration from that and figured it would be great if we could do this for the internet as well. Okay, let me see if I find a headset real quick, and maybe I'll improve the audio. 1 second. Okay, testing again. Is the audio better now?
Can you speak a little bit more so we can hear?
Okay, testing 1 2, testing 1 2.
Yeah, I think this is better. Thank you.
Okay. So okay, so we're back into the presentation. So as I mentioned, our idea of a solution to this was that inspiration from the environmental field and the idea of doing impact assessments. So the idea today is to give you an overview of that toolkit that we created, where we produced a framework for how you could do internet impact assessments, and then to walk you through one of those analyses that we've done, what we call internet impact briefs, where we use this framework to assess how a new policy could affect the internet. So starting with the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit, and this is something that you can find on our website. It basically has three main components to the toolkit. The first one is what you would think about as the baseline or the framework that you use in your analysis. And I'll speak a little bit more about those documents in greater detail, but those two documents that we produced are effectively trying to describe what the internet needs to exist, or important properties of the global network of networks. And then the second document describes what the internet really needs to thrive. How do we achieve those goals of around a open, secure, globally trustworthy internet? The toolkit also includes a methodology that is a form of guide that helps the user do these impact assessments themselves, as well as a collection of assessments from both ourselves and from our community and partners that we're collecting in a repository. And we call these short analyses Internet Impact Briefs. But starting with taking you through this framework that we've created, I wanted to start with the first document that you see on the screen to the upper left that we call the Internet Way of Networking. So this was a document that we produced in 2020. And the goal there was really to try to figure out how can we describe the internet in a useful way that allows you to assess change against the internet. So many of you are, I'm sure, is familiar with this description of the internet as a network of networks, and we 100% agree with that, but we figured it requires a little bit more detail if this is to be useful in internet impact assessments. So in consultation with our community and other experts, we set out to add a little bit more detail to that description of the internet as a network of networks, and identified what we call 5 critical properties of the internet. So in order for the networking model to be coherent with what we think about the internet, it would have these 5 critical properties. So for instance, when you're doing networking, the internet way of networking, you're striving to have a common protocol. You're striving to have a common global identifier system of, for instance, DNS or IP addresses. You have a layered architecture with interoperable building blocks or open standards. All of those things put together are those additional details to the description of the internet as a network of networks. So in this document, we describe these things in their ideal form, and I'll explain a little bit more later on why we describe it in the ideal, but the purpose is really to find a good reference point for where are we going, what should we be striving for. So for instance, many of you will say that, well, the internet actually has 2 protocols today. We have IPv4 and IPv6. So the current internet doesn't necessarily correspond to the ideal in all of its parts. But the important thing is that when you're doing networking this internet way, you're striving to have a common protocol. You're not, you don't find it sufficient to have 2 protocols. You want to have one protocol, a common protocol. So what that document gives you is really a view of what the internet needs to exist. But in 2021, we added on a complementary document around what the internet needs to thrive. And this is where we, again, together with our community and other experts, produced a document called Enablers of an Open, Globally Connected, Secure, and Trustworthy Internet. And the approach is a little bit similar, but basically we take a high-level goal like an open internet, and we try to break it down into its constitutive parts. What are the different things that goes into an open internet? So for instance, in an open internet, you have easy and unrestricted access. You have collaborative development and management and governance. And one of the reasons for breaking these high-level concepts down like this is that it allows you to give more nuance in an analysis. So you could have a policy that might affect the easy and unrestricted access, but it might not have any impact on collaborative governance. And those are the things that we want to be able to tease out in describing how something might impact the internet's openness, its security, or its trustworthiness, for instance. So to zoom in on one of these so-called enablers, to give you a feel of what they look like, if we zoom in on this enabler that we call easy and unrestricted access, you have the description here on the screen that is trying to present what that enabler looks like when it's in its sort of ideal form, namely that it's easy to become part of the internet, that internet connections are affordable, that internet services are accessible, and that there aren't any unnecessary regulatory or commercial barriers. So in this document, we describe those enablers and how they contribute to an open internet. And we also provide examples of things that might help us get closer to that ideal description and things that move us away. So for instance, in the examples that we provide, we'll point to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines as something that is a positive for this enabler. For instance, those guidelines help support screen readers for people with disabilities so that they can also have greater access to online services. So that's an example of something that is strengthening this enabler. Likewise, we have examples of things that might move us away from the ideal of this enabler, such as monopolies in the provisioning of internet access that could reduce affordability. So that's a quick overview to how we describe these things and the rationale for presenting them in this ideal form. And when you put this to work, because it might sound cumbersome to do impact assessment, but what it actually turns out to be in practice is almost like a checklist. So this sort of ideal description of thinking of how this works is that you would take a given policy or a technology, and then you would ask yourself a question like the one that you see on the screen here. Does this policy move us closer or further away from the ideal state of a critical property or an enabler? So you would ask that question vis-a-vis each of the critical properties and each of the enablers. And then once you see which direction that is heading, you can provide an analysis as to why you see the direction going in either a positive or a negative direction. And then you can summarize this in a more elaborate report, what we call internet impact briefs. So it might sound cumbersome, but it's actually really kind of like a checklist going through and thinking through the effects on these critical properties and enablers. Finally, I wanted to also provide you with a kind of overview of what this looks like in practice and illustrate this with one of the impact briefs that we recently published around interconnection rules in South Korea. So this was a analysis that we published in mid-May, written by myself and colleagues in the regions and other experts in the regions that contributed input to analyzing how these new rules could affect the internet. So to give you the short overview of what this brief is about, effectively, there has been a series of both enacted and proposed revisions to the Telecommunications Business Act in South Korea that spell out new interconnection rules for service providers. And in this analysis, we find that these new rules creates unnecessary costs and bottlenecks in South Korea's digital ecosystem, as well as increasing the risk of market concentration and dominance. So that's a summary overview of what we find in this brief, and I wanted to take you through what it looks like and hopefully inspire you to read more or the full brief online. But in all of these briefs, we try to start with providing the relevant context for these analyses. So in this case, it's a matter of new interconnection rules. Therefore, we start the brief with just describing how interconnection happens in the internet or the norms around interconnection in the internet. And presented as effectively, there is three forms of business arrangements on the internet. So you have, first of all, transit agreements where a network pays another network to carry traffic to all other parts of the internet. We also have peering arrangements where networks agree to exchange traffic between their customers. That can come either in the form of paid peering, where the networks agree to have a compensation for the traffic being sent. But most often it's in the form of settlement-free peering. In fact, some 99% of all of these interconnection agreements are actually settlement-free, where the networks exchange traffic without any settlements between them. So do we provide this in a brief as an important context to describe the environment in which these rules are then introduced. And I won't go through the technical details of these policies that we've seen in South Korea, but rather summarize what they translate to into in terms of effect. So the first one is that the rules effectively mandate the practice of paid peering. And that needs to be put in contrast to the norms on the internet, where some 99% are actually settlement free, but here there is a requirement to actually have paid peering between the networks. The rules also impose quality of service requirements on content providers, and the rules are a little bit ambiguous and could also apply to service providers that don't even have a direct relationship with a Korean ISP. Finally, they also impose an obligation on content providers to contract with local ISPs, even if they don't happen to have a direct relationship with those Korean ISPs. So those are effectively what the policies turn out to do in the environment. And then we look at what impact does this have on the internet when we look at the impact vis-a-vis critical properties and enablers. So this is a summary of what we found in this analysis. As you can see, it's a lot of red. The white is to indicate that we didn't see any impact. And I won't go through exactly the rationale for each of these impacts described, but rather I figured I'll give you a snapshot of one of the critical properties impacted and how we reasoned, and also one of the enablers and how we reasoned. So looking at one of the critical properties that we saw affected was this critical property around the general purpose and technology neutral network. And in order to understand how we saw that impact, it's useful to reiterate this ideal state of the critical property that we described. So in that ideal, the internet is a general purpose network that is also agnostic with regards to the content of each data package. And it's not optimized for any specific traffic characteristics. And the real benefit with this is that it allows innovators to innovate and pursue new innovations without any permissions from other parts of the network, and to do so knowing that the internet has these benefits and drawbacks. So the impact that we see from these rules is that, first of all, that quality, service quality gets conditioned on contracting with the ISP. Secondly, that it's a move away from this agnostic networking approach, and instead it gets conditioned by regulation and to have contracts across the global network. And in this regard, we also described that this poses a risk of fragmentation, where users cannot access online services that don't already have a contract with the local ISP. To put it in a clear example, let's say that you have an online service provider in Europe, and they have not contracted with that Korean ISP. That Korean ISP could drop their packets, and the end user in Korea would not be able to access that service until the European service contracts with the Korean ISP. And then if we then go and look at one of the enablers, and this is the enabler that I described previously, one of these enablers that we call easy and unrestricted access talks about that internet connection should be affordable, services accessible, and that there shouldn't be any regulatory or unnecessary regulatory commercial barriers. And the impact that we see from these rules is, first of all, that it effectively increases South Korea's reliance on transit links and disincentivizes local peering arrangement at the IXP. And one of the consequences of this great increased reliance on transit links is, first of all, that traffic within South Korea even goes on international transit links, which is accompanied by higher costs and higher latency for the user. It also has detrimental effects for new entrants in South Korea, where a new application or service provider, as they grow, they necessarily need to increase traffic costs as well, and kind of making them the victim of their own success. So this is an illustration of how we think about these impact assessment, how we use these ideal descriptions of the world, and then look at how different policies might move us in different directions, either moving us closer to the ideal or away from the ideal. But I would invite everyone to have a closer look at both this report that we wrote on South Korea, and also have a look at some of the other impact briefs that we've published together with partners and community members. I think we're up to around 16 at the moment on our website. And we're also inviting those that are interested and might have a policy or a technology that you would like to put through our assessment framework to do so, and also invite you to contribute that to the repository that we're building with these impact assessments, and that we're hoping to have a global nature and really help share practices across the globe and insights across the globe around the impact of different technologies and policies. So with that, thank you all very much for listening. I put my email at the bottom of the presentation there if you want to get in contact with me. I'm happy as well to stay on and answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Carl. Are there any questions for Carl in the room at this moment? No? All right, thank you very much, Carl. Then I would like to move on to the next part of the... Of course, of course. Okay.